Welcome back to another YouTube video. We got a short one today on bracing before you inhale. So where this came from is I was recording a Powerlifting Now video on my step-by-step cueing of my conventional deadlift. And as I was talking about bracing, I kind of thought about a new way to frame it that I hadn't talked about before. And the way I framed it is that we are bracing before we actually inhale, not during or after. I think the common thought process is that you inhale to brace, and that's kind of incorrect, and I'm gonna get to in a little bit, but this is the cueing and thought process here is nothing new. It's the framing of bracing before you inhale. Because what happens if we are cueing bracing correctly and we are bracing before we inhale is that initial brace before we actually breathe in is helping to limit the expansion as we inhale, because we don't want the air to expand. And I'm gonna get into that to a little bit more detail here soon. But if the air expands, that's not creating pressure. It's just expanding into new areas. Versus if we brace, limit the ability for the air to move and expand our body, that's actually going to create the intra-abdominal pressure we want. And it's gonna take that initial brace and even further it. And so as I've mentioned, the cueing I'm gonna go through is nothing new. If you've watched my low bar bracing video, one of my original videos I did, this is gonna be very similar. I'm not gonna cue it any different. It's more so what I hope this video is going to help with, and why I'm putting it out there, is if you approach this with the mindset and the framing that you are bracing before you inhale, applying these cues of bracing, hopefully it's going to give you a different effect just because of how you're going to process the information. Because when I posted this to Instagram and this new way of framing, I thought it was kind of a nice post to make on a story. And I was kind of taken aback by how many people messaged me and were kind of like mind blown that this was like a new way of thinking. And I even asked some other people to kind of get some feedback on it. And they're like, yeah, that is kind of a new way of framing it that could be beneficial. So because of that, I thought a short little YouTube video on it would be beneficial to put out. So before going through cueing, let's kind of go back again to the whole point of bracing is to limit the ability for air to expand to create then intra-abdominal pressure, which furthers the brace. And so by bracing before we actually inhale, that's how we're going to limit the expansion of the air. So to give an analogy on this, and not a perfect analogy, but hopefully one you'll understand about creating intra-abdominal pressure and why it's so important to not allow expansion, is let's take the idea of a balloon and a steel container. And in both of those, we're going to fill up with the same exact amount of air. With the balloon, it's going to expand. And I don't know the science of measuring air pressure, so bear with me if you do and I'm butchering this, but if you were to fill it up within a certain amount of air and it expands, the actual pressure within is not going to increase in the same manner as the steel container, which will not expand at all. It is staying in its same mold and the air is having to fit within inside it. And so when we brace before we inhale, that's exactly what we're trying to do. If we're the balloon and we have no brace, and we take a big breath, like you're just standing here and breathing, you're gonna see that expansion and the depression, the expansion and the depression as you breathe in and out. But if you're that steel container and you brace and you're tight and you breathe in, one, very little air can even go in because you're limiting the ability to expand. And then two, you're creating that steel compartment, so the air you breathe in is maximizing your intra-abdominal pressure versus the balloon is expanding, and the more air you breathe doesn't necessarily the more pressure you're creating because the expansion just furthers. And so to be like that steel container, we need to brace before we inhale. And there's really three components that go into bracing. We have one, external pressure from a belt, assuming most of the people who are probably watching this video and powerlift use a belt, we have that external pressure pushing against us, which is going to increase tightness due to the natural contraction that an external cue creates against us. If we push into ourselves, we're gonna naturally brace. That's basically what a belt is doing. Next, we have the internal pressure, which is going from the intra-abdominal pressure. So we have external and we have internal driving against each other to counteract itself. And then lastly, specifically more so on the squat when we're bracing, is we have the load. When you have heavy weight on your back, you are naturally going to tense up. The deadlift is a little bit different because yes, once you lift the weight, you're going to tense up naturally. But most of the time when we're bracing, we don't have that external load already creating that natural tension. So taking those three elements, if we combine all three of them together, that's how we're gonna have the best brace possible. We're gonna have the external pressure from the belt, we're gonna have the internal pressure from air and inhaling, and then we're going to have just the natural tension built from having a certain load we're either lifting from the ground or squatting on our back. So taking this idea and framing of bracing before we inhale, well, how do we do that? So getting into it, this is exactly what I recommended before, but the framing of it, I think for some people is gonna bring this all to light and how you should do it appropriately. And how we're going to brace before we inhale is through a light exhale that creates tightness and contraction with the obliques. So just to give a demonstration, when we exhale, that is going to naturally tighten our abdominals. Like if I'm really extended and I forcefully exhale, it's going to crunch me in. But I tend personally not to really think about contracting the abdominals, because a lot of times contracting the abdominals gets people to crunch too far over and depress. But when we think exhale and tighten the obliques, what that tends to more do is just draw the rib cage into place. And so that does two things. One, a lot of people teach that because it's going to help to align that rib cage and pelvis. But two, that's how we're bracing before we inhale. As we exhale, we're going to do that, tighten the obliques, and then hold on to those so that as we inhale, there's going to be less room for expansion. And how this works between the squat and deadlift is a little bit different, but the same principles apply. And like I said, the biggest thing with the squat is one, the bar is already on our back, so we're having to support the load. So even if you aren't actively thinking about bracing, you are. And then two, the squat also has a component of your low bar rack position creating tightness. But to give an idea of what inhaling looks like before we brace and kind of over exaggerating it, I'll kind of go from the side. If I have no tightness, I'm just standing here and I take a big, big breath. You see the expansion happen. You see the rib cage flare out. You see kind of my chest rise. I mean, I can think about breathing into my stomach, and if I breathe into my stomach, I'm going to expand there, but we don't really want to expand there because now we're lengthening the abdominals. That's not bracing, that's lengthening the abdominals and putting them arguably in a less advantaged position. We're wanting to do the opposite. We're wanting to create this tightness so that as we breathe, while some of our body might expand, not much of it. And so specifically in the squat, we're gonna do a light exhale. We're gonna draw those obliques in, and then we're gonna tighten there, and we're gonna hold that. We also have that bar on top of us that we're likely in some manner pulling into our back, which is gonna limit the ability for that rib cage to elevate, not only from the tightness of pulling it down in some manner, but also just the fact that the weight is bearing down on us. So exhale, tightness the obliques, bar into our back, and then as I breathe, it's a very minimal breath because very little is expanding. Between the external pressure of the belt cueing more tightness, and between the context of the oblique tightness and then the bar tightness in my back, as I breathe in, I'm that steel container. There's not much to expand into, so it's a very small breath, and every particle of air I breathe in is adding to the pressure, versus if I don't have any tightness, I have to breathe in a lot more air that is not giving me the bang for my buck that I want it to, and it's that balloon. It's expanding and limiting the pressure built up versus maintaining its same form and creating that intra-abdominal pressure we're looking for. On deadlift, like I said, it's a little bit different. We don't have a bar on our back. Depending on where you brace, like I brace at the top, I don't have any loading or any tension already built up, so it's fully on the contraction of my obliques to hold that position, which they can fully do so. The obliques are a great muscle in the sense of the isometric contraction they create in managing that rib cage position and managing the pelvis. Because, again, expansion. We're likely, if we're going to expand from the rib cage flaring. We can also expand from the pelvis moving back. And so the natural expansion that happens when we're not bracing is this flare and rotation of the pelvis versus light exhale, contract those obliques, breathe in. There's a little bit of expansion, but for the most part, we're creating this solid base between the belt, between the brace, and then inhaling into it that now we're very solidly tight in this position and maintain that as we now go through our setup and our movement. So hopefully that gave you a different framing idea of how to brace correctly. And like I said, if you've watched my other videos, a lot of this is nothing new other than a different way to cue and frame it. If you haven't watched my other videos, this is probably a great way to be able to get an introduction in how to properly brace on the squat and the deadlift, in the sense that we need to first brace and then inhale, and the majority of that initial brace is going to come through that light exhale, managing that oblique tightness, holding on to that, and maintaining that tightness as we breathe in, which only furthers the pressure we create from the external stimulus of the belt, the intra-abdominal pressure from the air coming in, and then just the loading of the movement creating natural tension. So if you have any questions, make sure to ask below and I'll be happy to get back to you. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't. Give the video a like if you know anyone else that would find this useful. Make sure to share it with them. And until next time, peace.